The house is quiet. Outside, the streets glisten with frost, and a pale winter moon hangs over the rooftops like a watchful eye. Inside, candles burn low. Shadows gather in the corners of the room, long and patient. It is Christmas Eve in the 19th century. The tree, if this household has one, is lit with real candles, tiny flames trembling above wax-like captive spirits. Somewhere down the lane, a carol is being sung slightly off-key. A carriage rattles by, wheels crunching on frozen mud, and then stillness. And in that stillness, someone clears their throat. A chair creaks, a page turns, and a voice, calm, measured, just a little theatrical, begins. When I first went down to stay at the old house, they told me not to sleep in the East Room. It is not a carol. It is not a sermon. It is not a merry toast. It is a ghost story. Because for the Victorians, Christmas wasn't just about goodwill, feasting, and holly. It was also about dead men tapping at bedroom doors, about phantom footsteps on the stairs, about the past rising up in the cold and reminding the living that time is a very thin sheet of ice indeed. On this podcast, we will go back to those rooms, back to those fires, back to an era that loved its ghost as much as its Christmas pudding. I'm Gregory Hallows, and this is the Preserve Halloween podcast. So, in a previous episode, we kind of opened the door on Victorian Christmas ghost stories. Their strangely cozy, deeply unsettling tradition of pairing hot punch and cold chills, plum pudding, and restless spirits. And in this episode, we're not going to just revisit that world. We're going to stay the night. This episode will expand our view. We're going to step beyond the familiar names and into a larger culture that made the Victorian era such fertile ground for ghosts, especially at Christmas time. No single author owns this territory, of course. Charles Dickens helped define it, of course. Others like M.R. James will later refine it. But the tradition itself, it is older, stranger, and much wider than just one pen. Over this course of this podcast, we're going to explore why Victorians thought Christmas was the perfect time for ghosts, how industrialization, grief, and spiritualism shaped the era's obsession with the supernatural, the patterns and mood of Victorian ghost stories, the lonely rooms, the haunted objects, the secrets buried under polite conversation, the social rituals of telling these stories on dark winter nights, and how the Victorian seasonal haunting still echoes today in the way we think about winter, about storytelling, and the thin places of the year. No jump scare anecdotes this time. Not going to tell any little tales that will take away from the focus. We're just going to take one long walk through the foggy streets of Victorian imagination where lamps burn low and nearly every house has a story it doesn't want to tell. So, imagine a Victorian winter evening, not as we see it now, through nostalgic snow globes and curated holiday movies, but how it really was. The dark arrives early, not like 5 o'clock early, afternoon early. The sun just gives up by midday, and the rest of the hours belong to gaslight and candle flame. Streets are frequently filthy and treacherous. Coal smoke hangs in the air like a low ceiling. The cities are crowded, noisy, and for the poor, brutal. Inside, homes are warmed by coal fires and oil lamps. Curtains are heavy. Windows rattle. The world feels small and enclosed. An island of light pressed on all sides by night. In this setting came the Industrial Revolution, uprooting old rhythms and replacing them with timetables and factory shifts. People moved from scattered rural communities into enormous humming cities. Old village customs, including midwinter gatherings and folktales, they would come with them, but they arrived in a very different environment. Victorians were surrounded by new technology they did not fully understand, rapid change that constantly unsettled them. high mortality, especially among children from disease, poverty, and labor, very, very dangerous labor, and a hunger for meaning in a world that appeared to have traded the old ways for steam engines and stock markets. This was a huge change. And at the same time, Victorian England was a culture obsessed with mourning, not like early in the day, actual mourning, death. Death was everywhere, in newspaper columns and street funeral processions, in crepe veils and elaborate mourning jewelry. Family portraits often included the dead, photographed in lifelike poses to preserve their memories forever. There were etiquette books specifically for grief, how long to wear black, when to re-enter society, what was considered decent and respectable. The Victorians did not hide death, they organized it. And beneath the rules and rituals, there was a rawness. So many people died so young that nearly every household had at least one absence that weighed heavily on the living. And that kind of collective grief demands some sort of expression. Christianity provided part of the answer, but faith, ritual, and narrative often work together. And there we enter ghost stories. When you live in a world where death is close, ghosts are never just entertainment. They are possibilities. They are a what if. They are the dream that the door might open one more time and someone you miss might be standing there, caught between this world and the next. The mindset blossomed in the 19th century as spiritualism, seances, mediums, table turning, attempts to speak directly with the dead. This became very popular. At the same time, advances in science and technology were casting doubt on old beliefs. Ghosts were pushed to the edges of respectable thought, and that's exactly where fiction thrives. So why Christmas? And the answer to that lies partly in tradition and partly in timing. Midwinter, long before the Victorians, was recognized as a liminal season. We've discussed this multiple times. This was a hinge of the year when days are the shortest and nights are the longest. In older European folklore, this was when the dead, the wild hunt, and the other uncanny forces were most likely to roam. Fires, feasts, and gatherings served as both protection and celebration. And when Christmas slowly evolved into a family-centered holiday in the 19th century, with time off of work, homecomings, shared meals, it inherited some of that older midwinter eeriness. The Victorians created the modern Christmas we recognize, or at least, partially responsible. Decorated trees, Christmas cards, crackers and parlor games, gift-giving rituals. The idea that Christmas was a time of memory and sentiment. They also revived and refined something much older, their tradition of telling ghost stories in the winter dark. Christmas brought families together into one room, maybe even just for one night, with nothing but the lamp and a firelight, or one or the other. There was no television, there was no streaming, there was no distractions beyond conversations and singing and absolutely storytelling. A ghost story at Christmas became a delicious contradiction. On one hand, you're safe, you're indoors, you're warm, you're surrounded by people that you love. And on the other hand, you are imagining danger, loss, and the supernatural pressing against your window. And, the Victorians love contrast: opulent feasts versus grim poverty, rigid etiquette versus wild inner emotion, bright shop windows versus dark alleys. Ghost stories at Christmas fit perfectly into their taste for tension. And as printing technology improved and periodicals spread across the country, that tradition gained a whole new channel, a whole new way to be spread. Magazines realized that Christmas numbers, special winter issues, sold especially well when they included ghost stories. And there was a lot of writers who would answer that. Some were already famous for other work, others specialized in the strange and unsettling, and the result was a seasonal flood of tales. Lonely country houses visited by something unsaid, apparitions that appeared only in mirrors, letters found in locked drawers revealing long-buried crimes, spectral warnings delivered too late to save the living. These were all stories that invited readers to lean into fear just enough to feel the chill, but not enough to break the spell of home. So the industrial shadows, the culture of mourning, the midwinter darkness, the emerging Christmas as family celebration, all made Victorians perfectly positioned to fall in love with seasonal ghosts. So, our lamps are lit, family is gathered, our magazines are open. So let's turn the page. If you strip away the specific plots and characters, Victorian Christmas ghost stories, they all share a kind of shared architecture. It's not, a formula per se, but it's a very familiar shape. We see over and over again, there are settings withdrawn from the bustle of the city. You're in a country house, you're in a lonely inn, you're a seaside villa in the off season, you're in the older wing of a large estate, you're, isolated, you're by yourself. There's always a narrator with a reasonable mind. He or she often skeptical, but they are always finding themselves needing to recount the inexplicable. There's an intrusion of the past into the present. There's a crime, there's betrayal, and an unrighted wrong. There's some event that never truly ended. And there is a haunting that responds to emotion. These are not random acts of malice. They are as if their grief, their guilt, or some obsession summons these ghosts. Christmas is almost always present in the background. There's guests gathering for the holiday. Snow will separate the characters from the outside world. Fires and candlelight play with shadow. Bells, carols, or church services echo faintly somewhere beyond the haunted room. And the season itself becomes somewhat of a frame. This uncanny event becomes that thing which happened at Christmas that one year. And therefore, it's something that you remember, something that's retold, something that's shared again and again and again as the nights grow longer. And the tone of these stories is very distinctive. Victorian Christmas ghosts rarely leap out with violent shocks. They're not jump scaring people. Instead, they arrive slowly with creeping certainty. They bring a door that keeps appearing slightly ajar. They're a chair that seems to have been moved, a figure glimpsed once at a great distance, then again closer. A repeated sound, soft knocking, the swish of fabric, an inexplicable cough. Something that becomes unbearable because of its, repetitiveness and regularity. And this is horror that doesn't live in gore, but in atmosphere. This is what I guess we would call now a slow burn or, educated horror, which is crazy. The narrators, who are often urbane, educated, and, sometimes very funny, gradually lose their composure as they become convinced that what they are experiencing is not their imagination. The reader moves with them. We're along for the ride. Step by step, we go down the same path as they do into that conviction. And the ghosts themselves can vary. Some are remorseful, some are very angry. Many are just embodiments of an unresolved event. Victorians, surrounded by physical reminders of the dead, often treated ghosts as unfinished business made visible, which is, justifying grief and justifying, people have to justify things. In many of these tales, justice is finally done because the ghost appears. Hidden letters are found, body locations are revealed, family secrets are forced into the open, wronged individuals have their stories recognized at last. So there's a conclusion to the problems. In others, the purpose of the ghost is less clear. It may appear only once, silently, and then never see it again. The narrator is not left with answers, but with a lifelong memory that resists explanation. So that's even worse. There's no solution. And that ambiguity is the key. Victorian Christmas ghost stories operate in a space between belief and disbelief. A reader can enjoy them whether they think ghosts are real or not. The supernatural is presented with seriousness, but it's never forced upon the reader. Instead, the question slowly emerges. What haunts us more, the dead or the living? Is the ghost an external entity or the projection of guilt, grief, and fear by, the storyteller? Is it a punishment, a warning, or simply a symptom of a mind pushed too far into isolation and memory? Are you just going crazy? The Victorian writers never entirely answer, and that is the brilliant way to handle a story. Don't explain anything, and you don't have to answer. They leave the lamp burning in the hallway, the door half open, the footprints fading in the snow. The reader supplies the rest. So your imagination is part of the story. One of the reasons these stories work so well at Christmas is that the holiday already encourages reflection. You're thinking about your year. You're, reflecting on the good and the bad. People will return to childhood homes. They sleep in their old room. They see relatives they may not spoken to all year or even longer. They remember earlier Christmases, both joyful and difficult. The physical house becomes layered with time. And this is where we used to hang our stockings. This is where we sat last year. This is where so-and-so happened. This is where, Uncle Joe used to sit before he died. So memories trigger a lot of things. Ghost stories slot naturally into that mental landscape. They externalize it. What if those memories had bodies? What if the past refused to remain politely in the past? What if the season that insists on togetherness also invited the return of those who can't be present? That's the emotional core of the Victorian seasonal haunting. It is not just fear, but it is return. So, to really understand the Victorian Christmas ghost tradition, you have to imagine not just the story themselves, but the way they were shared. Picture a parlor lit by a single oil lamp and a low, steady fire. The furniture has all been pulled inward closer to the hearth. Outside, the wind rattles the windows and presses snow against the glass. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with tobacco, spiced drinks, and the ever-present smell of coal. The evening has followed a familiar pattern. You have dinner, maybe a little concert at the piano if you're lucky, play some parlor games, maybe a round or so, maybe two. Slowly, the conversation has narrowed. Someone mentions a strange thing that once happened in their family. Another guest, encouraged, offers a story of their own. And then someone, often the host of the party, suggests, let's have a sit-down ghost story, right? And then a hush falls over the room, right? And it's not because they're silent. It's everyone's ready. They're ready to pay attention. The storyteller, because we mentioned this before, the storyteller may simply read from a new Christmas magazine because that was just, been pressed and is, they bought this specifically for these reasons. Or they may tell a tale from their own memory using their own voice as the instrument, and their pacing is the only special effect. There's something ancient and elemental in the scene, a circle of humans, a source of warmth, and a story about the things that dwell in the dark beyond the light. This is history. This has happened forever, storytelling. The Victorians, for all their factories and railways, they still recognized the power of storytelling. Many of the ghost tales that later appeared in print, they just started as stories that were told among friends. And Christmas amplified that. It was one of the rare times of the year when extended families and guests would gather, and this is across generations. Children would hear stories that were never told in their normal lives. Elders, sometimes maybe drunk and full of nostalgia, would reveal events that they haven't talked about for decades. Ghost stories are kind of like a social release valve. They are a way to relieve tension. And ghost stories allow people to discuss death and regret and fear and all the strange experiences they can't explain. And this is all under the guise of entertainment. So no one's going to really make fun of them because they're just telling a story, right? And if someone has a problem with it, the storyteller can just say, oh, look, it's just a story. This isn't serious. I don't believe this. And if somebody got scared and believed every word they were saying, that's awesome too. So print culture and parlor culture, they fed on each other. You wouldn't have all these print magazines and all these ghost stories if people weren't telling them. Magazines published Christmas. This stuff was packed with ghost stories exactly because they knew families would read them aloud on these cold evenings. And because of this, the popularity of these gatherings encouraged editors to commission more. So what happened was you get stuck in a seasonal loop, right? Winter darkness comes, people get stuck indoors so they could gather. When people gather, they want to tell stories. These stories are then printed and demands for new tales grow. New tales shape expectations, and then people gather again the next year, hoping to hear a new ghost story. So the Christmas ghost story became less of a genre and more of a ritual, a seasonal ritual. The Victorians would have recognized this as part of a larger pattern. They used ritualized fear to create cohesion. Just as Krampusnacht in alpine regions let communities dance, with the monstrous to safeguard the year ahead. English Christmas ghost stories let families flirt with the uncanny to reaffirm their safety and warmth. So these stories have purpose. The ghost is out there in the story, in the pages, in the dark lanes, in the lonely moors. They're not in the circle where the listener's sitting and being scared. They're not going to be harmed because these are just stories. But when everyone goes to bed and the house is completely silent, there is always that moment when someone blows out their candle and they wish they had not heard that story. They wish that the storyteller was not so vivid with their storytelling, and now they have to walk down those long, long corridors by themselves. But that's a sign of a good story, right? So as the 19th century faded into the 20th, the world that birthed the Victorian Christmas began to change. Now you're getting electric light creeping into homes, and it dilutes the power of the shadows because they're not existent anymore. There's lights everywhere. Cities grew even louder and more brightly lit. Lots of cities had street lamps and lights everywhere. The First World War tore a hole in the cultural fabric so large that no amount of sentiment could entirely patch it. And yet, these traditions didn't vanish. They just shifted. Writers in the early 20th century, some of them writers from the Victorian era, they learned these habits as children. They carried this fire and this tradition forward. New tales would appear on magazines, but also on radio and eventually on television, and they kept these Christmas ghost stories alive. They kept the winter settings. They kept the reflective tone. They kept the slow dread, just in a different format. In some countries, this tradition remained explicit. Ghost stories were still recognized as a seasonal midwinter art form, but in other places, it quieted into the background, just leaving traces rather than, experiencing this every year. But this legacy lasts still. Holiday specials sometimes often include a spiritual or supernatural element. Films set in the winter where the house is as much as a character as the people. There's many, many examples of this. The Shining. The countless anthologies of ghost stories for Christmas that continue to appear on bookstore shelves, still popular sellers. Victorian seasonal hauntings also left deeper marks. This cemented the idea that winter is a time for ghosts, even outside of Halloween. Popularized a kind of story where the supernatural is not loud and flashy, but quiet and persistent. Proved that you can move readers profoundly with a single well-placed chill rather than constant shocks and jump scares. And showed that the places we feel safest, our homes, our families, our holiday rituals, they are also the best place to explore our most unsettling questions. So in that sense, the Victorian Ghost Story is as close a relative of Halloween's own traditions as anything. Halloween asks us to acknowledge the presence of death and the past in the midst of life and harvest. Victorian Christmas Ghost Stories asks us to acknowledge the same thing in the midst of feasting and family. And both of these holidays and both of these traditions insist that memory has weight. Both insist that we live not only with the living, but with everyone who has ever walked through our lives and then vanished. So, in this podcast, as we reawaken these whispers in the winter dark, we aren't just indulging in nostalgia for cobblestone streets and gaslight windows. We're recognizing that this type of thing is something that endures. Human beings need nights where they gather around and tell stories. Nights when the world slows down, nights when the lights are low, nights when a story can travel from one voice to many ears, carrying with it comfort and unease. If you strip away the specific clothing of the era, the stiff collars, the crinolines, the gas lamps, the core of the tradition and the experience is timeless. We are small, the night is big. We gather in the glow and speak of the shadows beyond it. The Victorians have been gone a really long time. Their houses have changed, their Christmas trees, their cards, their tables and parlors are all dust. But their ghosts, those we still invite in every time we sit by a fire or a flickering screen and seek a story that makes the back of our neck hair stand up just a little bit. right? That still exists. We've walked the snow-covered streets. We've listened at the doors. We've felt the draft in an otherwise closed room and wondered if it might be more than just poor insulation. And now the hour is late. So we've roamed through drawing rooms and down unlit corridors, browsed the brittle pages of Christmas numbers and magazines long out of print, and looked into the faces of a culture that met its grief and its curiosity halfway in a ghost story. So as we move forward, we can return to this well as often as we like. I think I'm going to explore some specific authors, some specific stories. I may even read a few specific hauntings that have survived, centuries. The Victorians left us with a library of just brilliant works of art. And, I've only touched on a little bit of it. But for this episode, I'm going to let the house grow quiet. I'm going to blow out the candle. I'm going to draw the curtains. And I'm going to ask you, just for a moment even, to listen to the winter night outside your own window. If you hear something, it's probably just the wind. Probably. So I'm going to leave you with some suggestions for some books that you might want to check out. Some of these I may have mentioned before, but I want to mention them again. Victorian Ghost Stories, an Oxford Anthology by Michael Cox and R.A. Gilbert. The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. The Signal Man by Charles Dickens. Also by Charles Dickens, The Haunted House. This is a collection of stories. At the End of the Passage by Rudyard Kipling. Anything by M.R. James, honestly, I would recommend anything. The Judge's House by Bram Stoker. Here's a specific title for M.R. James if you want. Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. But, honestly, anything M.R. James has done is gosh, just read it. Uncanny Tales by Vernon Lee. And The Victorian Supernatural by Pamela Thurschwell. Those are all some books that I would recommend, or authors to check out, or whatever. And before I go, I'm going to do my plea. Not a plea. That sounds sad. I'm going to just ask you guys if you would like to donate to the podcast. There's a link in the description, and also links all over this page for a PayPal, or there's a donation set up through the podcast itself. Just as little as $1 if you want to donate, it would help me tremendously. I want to do way more of this stuff, and if I can have some funding behind it, it would make it substantially easier. So check out that. I hope you enjoyed this re-look at Victorian Ghost Stories. We're going back into it from the podcast a couple episodes ago. But in the meantime, stay strange, stay curious, stay spooky, and always preserve Halloween.